Deep in the forest where the morning mist hung heavy between twisted roots and gnarled branches, she walked cautiously, her feet sinking into the damp earth. Every step muffled by the fallen leaves, she thought she was alone in the quiet until a faint sound drifted to her ears, a soft whimper that did not belong to any bird or small animal she had ever heard. Her heart jumped, and she froze, listening. The sound repeated. A tiny cry, muffled yet urgent, it seemed to call out to her as if it knew she would come. She followed the sound, stepping over roots and ducking under low-hanging branches. The forest grew denser, the sunlight barely reaching the ground, and shadows twisted around her like living things. The whimper led her to a small clearing surrounded by charred tree trunks and scorched earth. She stepped closer, and her breath caught in her throat. There in the center was a nest, woven from twigs and leaves, and in it lay several tiny creatures barely bigger than her hands. Their scales shimmered faintly with colors she could not name. Their eyes wide with fear and wonder. She crouched slowly, her heart hammering, as the smallest one lifted its head and made a sound like a tiny hiss of smoke. She reached out her hand, trembling, her fingers brushing against the warmth of their bodies. They were cold but alive and fragile. She could feel the rapid beating of their tiny hearts under her palm. A mixture of fear and awe surged through her. She remembered the stories the villagers told of the deadliest dragon that had ruled the skies centuries ago, its wrath burning forests and villages in flames. She swallowed hard and looked down at the hatchlings, their innocent eyes staring back at her without understanding, yet somehow trusting. She felt an overwhelming desire to protect them. Even though every instinct told her to run and leave them behind, she gathered the hatchlings, carefully lifting them one by one, wrapping them in her cloak, their tiny claws gripping her fingers. She murmured soothing words, wishing she could tell them they were safe, though she did not know if it was true yet. As she turned to leave the clearing, she glanced back at the charred trees, and smoke rising from the ground. A shiver ran down her spine. She had no idea what she had found or what it would become, but she knew in that moment her life had changed forever, and the weight of the unknown pressed upon her like the forest itself, holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her arms full of the tiny hatchlings, their warmth seeping into her hands, and yet her mind raced with warning and doubt. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath, as if it too waited for her decision. She remembered the old tales whispered by the villagers of the deadliest dragon, a creature of fire and fury whose wrath had burned entire forests and left villages in ash. She felt a shiver run down her spine. Could these fragile creatures truly be connected to that legend, or was it only fear speaking in her ears? She looked down at the hatchlings, their tiny bodies trembling against her chest, their eyes wide and trusting, and a strange tenderness filled her chest like nothing she had ever known. She could not bear the thought of leaving them to die alone in the scorched forest. She pressed them closer, feeling their fragile wings brushing against her arms, every instinct telling her to protect them, even if it meant danger. She weighed the choice carefully. To leave them was to let them perish. To take them was to invite unknown peril into her life, yet her heart would not allow it. She whispered softly to them, soothing words she did not know they understood. She could feel their tiny claws clutching at her fingers, their trust binding her to them in a way she could not break. She knew that stepping forward was not only a choice, it was a promise to these creatures that she would care for them, guide them, and keep them safe, even if she could not foresee the consequences. Her chest tightened with a mixture of fear, awe, and determination, and with a deep breath she turned away from the clearing, carrying them toward her cabin through the mist and shadows. The forest seemed to shift around her, the unknown waiting beyond every tree, and yet in that moment, she felt an unshakable certainty that she could not abandon them, and that whatever they would become, she would face it. Alongside them, the cabin door creaked as she stepped inside the small wooden space, the hatchlings chirping softly in her arms. The fire had long burned low, leaving shadows flickering across the walls. She lowered them gently onto a pile of blankets, their tiny wings trembling. As they explored the new space, she watched every movement, her heart racing with a mixture of awe and fear. The smell of smoke and earth clung to them, and she found herself inhaling it, as if to memorize the moment. She moved, carefully bringing bowls of warm milk and crumbs of bread, watching as they nuzzled the food hungrily, her hands shaking as she offered each punkerly. I whispered soft words telling them they were safe, though she did not know if it was true. Yet the smallest one hissed softly, and a curl of smoke drifted from its nostrils. She froze for a heartbeat, then laughed, nervously brushing the smoke away, thinking it was only a trick of her imagination. She tidied the blankets around them, and watched their small eyes follow her every movement. A thrill ran through her knowing she was the only one who had found them, the only one who could protect them, yet a shadow of doubt lingered. Could she truly keep them safe, or was she bringing danger into her own life and the lives of others? She shook the thought away, pressing her hands to her chest and feeling the warmth of their tiny bodies. She could not abandon them now. The choice was made, and though fear and uncertainty clawed at her, she felt a strange joy in her heart. She had become their guardian, and from this night onward their lives would be bound together in ways she could not yet imagine. Nights passed, and the hatchlings grew bolder, exploring every corner of the cabin, their tiny claws tapping softly against wooden floors and walls. She watched them with a mixture of wonder and trepidation, each movement a reminder of their fragile power. The smallest one flapped its wings for the first time, and she held her breath, fearing it would fall. Yet it rose awkwardly and landed with a soft thud. A thrill ran through her chest, and she laughed softly at their determination. She fed them carefully milk and bits of bread, noticing how quickly they learned to drink and eat on their own. Their eyes followed her constantly, and a strange bond grew between them, each chirp and hiss like a conversation. She could almost understand. She found herself talking to them endlessly, telling them stories about the forest, about the sun and moon, and about the small human life they had stumbled into. Yet every now and then, a curl of smoke drifted from their nostrils, or a tiny claw left a scratch on her sleeve, and she shivered, realizing they were not ordinary creatures. She brushed the thought aside, telling herself it was only play. She stayed up nights watching their fragile wings twitch, dreaming of the day they would fly higher than she could imagine. A feeling of pride and fear twisted inside her. She could not yet see the full extent of what they would become, but she sensed it like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. She pressed the smallest one close to her chest, feeling its warmth, and whispered promises of safety, even though she did not know if she could keep them from the world outside or from themselves. The hatchlings began following her everywhere, climbing onto her shoulders, curling around her neck, and sometimes tugging at her hair with tiny claws. She laughed, despite the scratches and the heat of their small bodies pressed against her. She marveled at how quickly they learned her routines, how they mimicked her movements, and sometimes even her expressions. She spoke to them softly, telling them secrets and dreams she had never shared with anyone, and they seemed to listen, their eyes shining with curiosity and something else she could not name. She noticed how they responded to her moods. When she was sad, they nuzzled closer. When she was happy, they chirped and flapped their wings with excitement. She could not believe the depth of connection she felt to creatures so strange, so powerful, and yet so fragile. A strange warmth filled her chest, and a knot of worry tightened at the same time. She knew they were growing stronger, and somehow she felt that the world outside would never understand them. The smallest one curled against her neck, releasing a tiny puff of smoke that tickled her skin, and she giggled, pressing her cheek against its warm scales. She whispered promises she did not fully understand herself, that she would protect them, teach them, and love them for as long as she could, even if the forest and the world beyond would one day demand more of them than she could give. Change came quickly after the scholar's warning, as if the hatchlings themselves sensed the truth. Pressing closer to the surface, their bodies grew almost overnight, wings stretching wider, scales hardening into sharper patterns that glimmered when the light struck them. The humans struggled to keep pace with their needs, building stronger shelters, gathering more food, and reinforcing the ravine nest with stone and earth. Yet no amount of preparation could quiet the unease settling deep in their chest. The first accident happened without warning. The darker hatchling, startled by a sudden noise, snapped its jaws shut, and a bolt of lightning cracked against the ravine wall, shattering stone and sending fragments skidding across the ground. The human barely had time to shield their face as dust filled the air, and the hatchling froze in terror, scrambling toward the human and pressing its head against their legs. Trembling with guilt, the human knelt, immediately wrapping their arms around the shaking creature, murmuring reassurances, even as their heart thundered. Soon fire followed, small bursts at first, accidental flares when the hatchlings sneezed or cried, thin tongues of flame licking across the stone, leaving blackened scars. The human adapted quickly, soaking cloth in water, keeping sand close, and moving with constant alertness. Yet despite the danger, the hatchlings never once turned their power toward the human. Instead, they curved their bodies away instinctively, as if some unspoken law bound them. What frightened the human most was not the destruction but the control growing beneath it. The silver-green hatchling learned to summon wind to lift itself briefly from the ground, hovering with focused determination, while the smallest hatchling, whose weakness had once worried the human, began producing a low humming resonance that made the air vibrate and calmed the others instantly. The human sensed that this sound carried authority far beyond its size. Night, the ravine glowed faintly with heat and energy, lightning crawling across the rocks like living veins while wind spiraled lazily above the nest. The human lay awake listening to distant thunder that did not belong to any storm, knowing deep down that the scholar had spoken truth, yet still unable to imagine abandoning the creatures who trusted them completely. The bond between them had grown to deep, woven through care, fear, sacrifice, and love. And even as the hatchlings changed into something the world would fear, the human remained at their center. The one presence they would never harm. The world beyond the ravine began to shift in subtle, fearful ways. Shepherds spoke of skies that rumbled without clouds, and fields where grass lay flattened in perfect spirals as if pressed by invisible wings. Livestock were found unharmed, yet singed the air around them heavy with the scent of ozone and smoke, and every report carried the same uneasy conclusion that something old had awakened the human herd. None of these whispers remaining hidden within the ravine, focused only on keeping the hatchlings fed and calm. Yet the signs crept closer. Each night thunder echoed nearer than before, and distant flashes lit the horizon, painting the cliffs in brief, violent light. The hatchlings would pause mid-play, lifting their heads as if listening to a call carried on the wind, their wings twitching with restless energy. In the nearest settlement fear took root. Hunters sharpened blades and reinforced armor. Scholars argued over half-forgotten prophecies, and elders recalled stories passed down as warnings never meant to become real. Riders were gathered, chosen not for bravery but desperation, and sent toward the mountains to find the source of the disturbance and end it before it could grow. As the riders approached the ravine, the land itself seemed to resist them. Paths twisted, winds shifted, and the air grew heavy, making each breath a struggle. Some turned back, claiming the mountain rejected their presence, while others pressed on, driven by terror greater than doubt. That night the human sensed something wrong, a pressure in the air that made breathing difficult. The hatchlings pressed close, unusually silent, their eyes fixed on the ravine entrance where shadows moved unnaturally. The smallest hatchling began, its low humming sound vibrating through the stone like a warning bell. And though the human did not yet know it, the world had already chosen sides, and the storm was finally arriving. Beyond the ravine, fear gathered strength and shape, like a living thing creeping from village to village. Carried on hurried voices and sleepless nights. People spoke of thunder rolling beneath clear skies, and of shadows crossing the moon too large to be clouds. Fields were scorched in perfect arcs, and streams boiled briefly before cooling again, leaving fish stunned but alive. Every sign pointed to an awakening power, and none dared say the old name aloud. The human remained unaware of the spreading panic, consumed by the fragile balance within the ravine. Yet even there the change could be felt. The air thickened with static, and the stones hummed faintly underfoot. Each dusk brought flashes of distant light that painted the mountains in violent color, and the hatchlings responded instinctively, lifting their heads in unison, wings half-spread, bodies tense as though hearing a call the human could not. In the nearest settlement council, fires burned through the night. Elders argued, scholars pleaded, and hunters volunteered, knowing some truths could not be outrun. Weapons were blessed, armor reinforced, and old wards dug from forgotten vaults. The decision was made to ride for the mountains, not to understand but to destroy before the threat could grow beyond control. As the riders moved closer, the land itself seemed to rebel. Winds shifted without warning, trails vanished, and horses balked, refusing to step forward. Some riders turned back, pale and shaking, convinced the mountain was alive, and watching. Others pushed on, driven by fear greater than reason. That night the human woke to a crushing pressure in the air, as if the sky itself leaned down upon the ravine. The hatchlings pressed tightly against them, unusually silent, their eyes locked on the narrow entrance where shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally. The smallest hatchling began its deep, resonant hum, vibrating through stone and bone alike, and though the human could not yet name the feeling, they knew with chilling certainty that the outside world had found them, and nothing would ever be the same. The riders entered the ravine at first light, their armor dull and scarred, their faces tight with fear and resolve, weapons raised as they advanced slowly, expecting an ambush. At any moment the humans stepped forward, instinctively placing themselves between the intruders and the hatchling's heart pounding yet body unmoving. The hatchlings reacted instantly, spreading out in a wide arc around the human. Wings flared, low growls vibrating through their small chests. The leader shouted commands, demanding the creatures be surrendered. or slain, warning that what they protected would one day burn the world. The human shouted back, refusing to move, insisting they were still young, still learning, still capable of choosing a different path. But the riders advanced regardless, boots crunching against stone blades, glinting in the rising light. The silver-green hatchling summoned a sudden gust of wind that slammed into the riders, forcing them back, while the darker one crackled with lightning dancing across its scales. Uncontrolled yet restrained, its body angled protectively away from the human. The smallest hatchling pressed against the human's legs, its hum rising in intensity, sending shockwaves through the air that rattled weapons and shook resolve. An arrow flew, striking stone near the human's feet, and in that instant something broke. The hatchling's eyes burned bright with ancient fury and fear intertwining. They did not attack, the human felt that clearly. Instead they shifted closer, forming a living wall, and when the riders raised their weapons again, the ravine itself answered. Heat, wind, and power spiraled outward, and the human realized with sudden clarity that the world had come to erase their family, and the hatchlings would not allow it. The moment the first blade struck the stone, the storm was unleashed. Fire roared skyward in a spiraling column, lightning split the air with deafening force, and wind crushed outward, flattening riders and weapons alike. Yet at the center of the chaos, the humans stood untouched, surrounded by a circle of calm, the hatchlings' bodies glowing with unleashed power. As they shielded the one who had chosen them, the riders fled those who could, leaving scorched armor and shattered courage behind. As the ravine settled into eerie silence, the human fell to their knees, shaking, finally understanding the truth. The scholar had tried to warn them of these were not lost creatures but the heirs of devastation. The hatchlings returned to the human, immediately nuzzling close, their fury gone, replaced by desperate affection. And in that moment the human understood. Their fate was sealed, not as a destroyer or a victim, but as the only being these future rulers of sky and storm would ever obey.